All right, I am here with a man that needs no introduction in the keto world, Dr. Dom D'Agostino. Awesome to have you here, man.
Great to have you here on our turf. Yeah.
So jumping right into it, I guess we don't need to go into a lot of detail on your background. I think almost everyone that would be watching a Dom and Tom video is probably somewhat experienced with keto in at least the beginning stages, or at least might know who you are. But let's just jump right into the context. So we wanted to discuss what is really the difference between being in ketosis versus being fat adapted, in fat adaptation. I think people tend to think they're synonymous, but they're not.
Yeah, so we talked about it's a spectrum, right? Fat adaptation is really a spectrum. And it kind of comes down to carbohydrate restriction. So as you restrict carbohydrates, your body will adapt to oxidizing and burning more fats, right? So you can be fat adapted athlete and do really well on a low carb diet that's not ketogenic. And you could do well losing weight, you could do well monitoring or reducing your blood glucose fluctuations, things like that. But in the ketogenic diet is unique in that it's defined by the elevation of a biomarker, which are ketones that can be measured in the blood, in the urine, and breath. And that is the only diet that I'm aware of that really is clinically defined by the elevation of a metabolite, the ketones. So you can be, when you are in a state of ketosis, that is probably like maximally fat adapted. That means the ketones are derived from fat. So the higher the ketone levels would be indicative of suppressing the hormone insulin, and the suppression of the hormone insulin is really what drives beta oxidation of fatty acids, not only in the muscles, but in the liver, which stimulates the ketogenesis process. And there are a variety of different enzymes and mechanisms associated with producing ketones, and people vary in that regard. But I think that's the true sort of difference between being low carb or fat adapted. You can be fat adapted and burning fat, but not necessarily to the point where you're suppressing insulin, where you are generating ketone production. So the true difference then is if you were fat adapted, you could be following a low carb approach and be burning a significant amount of fat. Remember, it's on a spectrum, right? But the farther you're shifted into fat burning, being fat adapted, then that enters the world of ketosis. And with the ketogenic diet being defined by an elevation of ketones measured in blood and breath, that is where you're truly suppressing the hormone insulin and your body is dramatically shifting into a higher fat adapted state. And we know that that's used in the context of many therapeutic applications like epilepsy. It's highly effective, and we know that being in that state of ketosis actually changes your brain neuropharmacology, and the elevation of ketones then are supplying an alternative energy to the brain. So there may be additional benefits to being in a state of ketosis relative to just being low carb and fat adapted. So that's an important concept.
I put a link down below. You can save 25% off your entire grocery order with Thrive Market. So Thrive Market is an online grocery store that just ships everything to your doorstep. It's so easy, but that's not what makes it cool. There's lots of online retailers. They have better for you options. Okay, so I've sat with them and I have even vetted some of the products that they bring on the shelves. Okay, so it's really about how can we get the good products on the shelves to give people good options. And you can sort by different diet types. So I have like fasting bundles. I have all this stuff that I've sorted in terms of my favorite foods. So that things like chomp sticks or maybe Rome sticks, like these really good quality beef or pork sticks, great proteins to break a fast with, and you can keep them in the car with you. Like there's nothing better than having a chomp stick or something really high quality. So anyway, the point is, I put a link down below. It'll save you 25% off your entire grocery order, okay, not just one item. Entire grocery order, plus you get a free gift. So that link down below, 25% off Thrive Market, and a big thank you to them. So it's safe to say though that someone can be in ketosis, say they're just starting out with a ketogenic diet, they can be in ketosis but not yet fat adapted, right? You can still be in ketosis but not necessarily mitochondrially developing the mitochondrial machinery to be fat adapted, so to speak.
Yeah, so that's that's a very good point. So you could be fasting or on a ketogenic diet, and within a couple days you'll enter a state of ketosis, but the metabolic machinery that's associated with ketone production, ketone utilization, and ketone transport into tissues like the brain and across the blood-brain barrier are not yet ramped up. So you could measure sort of the protein for the monocarboxylic acid transporter and see that it's relatively low, but after several weeks you could see a ramping up of ketolytic enzymes, ketogenesis enzymes, and things like that. So that is indicative of, you know, being fat adapted, and it's not really experimentally clearly defined outside of animal models. So, but mammalian physiology has a pretty good carryover effect as far as metabolism. So research is being done now on fat adaptation, and we know anecdotally that the more we follow a low carb approach or the ketogenic diet, the more we follow it, the easier it gets and the more benefits we derive from it. Also, our ketones get elevated faster if we were to maintain ketosis, get off of it, and then jump back in. And that's called metabolic switching. And we were talking about that previously, and we can delve into that topic.
Yeah, because you were, I mean, we don't have to go into the details of the study, but you were involved with the study that was surrounding metabolic switching, which I think is, talk about in a second, because I mean, I do a lot of content surrounding you know, various ways to stimulate PPAR and kind of trigger that, you know, fat adaptation and PGC1A and trying to drive that mitochondrial biogenesis to kind of, because essentially it comes down to a multiple number of mitochondrial half-lives to ultimately develop full fat adaptation. Is that like, so basically the mitochondria kind of is transforming through multiple half-lives to ultimately, so eventually you're coming with partial fat adaptation leading to, I guess, what you could conclude to call full fat adaptation, although it's probably not an official term.
It's an energetic stress, if you want to call it, use the word hormetic stress, like if you're fasting or on a ketogenic diet. And actually, initially, when you put animals on a ketogenic diet, assume it happens with humans, is that there's actually an elevation in reactive oxygen species. And a number of systems and mechanisms are put into place where there's a transition to greater oxidative phosphorylation relative to glycolytic pathways. And that will stimulate, as you had mentioned, an increase in mitochondrial biogenesis. So in animal models, you see like the muscle itself, you know, there'll be more mitochondria, they're burning more fat, and that's just to necessitate the energetic stress associated with decreasing glucose availability. Suppression of the hormone insulin decreases the glycolytic pathways, and then the body is basically forced to derive ATP, our energetic currency, from beta oxidation of fatty acids. And then that accelerated at a high rate in the liver will then spill into ketone production, which functions as an alternative fuel that in many situations can replace glucose as a primary energy source if you're deep into ketosis or deep into fasting.
Which brings up a good point, because when you're starting ketosis, you're starting a ketogenic diet or anything like that, and you're not fat adapted, one could imply that, oh, well, you're going to immediately bonk because you don't have the mitochondrial machinery. Mm-hmm. But from what we were talking about earlier, like you even noticed even with your own self-experimentation that even when you are declining in glucose levels for whatever reason, absence of carbohydrates, manipulation, insulin, whatever, actually having the ketones in the bloodstream, having the presence of ketones can sort of offset that. So there's almost an immediate response that the cells can still utilize these ketones without fat adaptation.
Absolutely, yeah. So the ketones then are a really good buffer. We have an evolutionary counter-regulatory mechanism where, you know, as glucose levels fall, glycogen levels get depleted after about 48 hours. It's really, the elevation of ketones are to ensure stable energy flow to the central nervous system. So we are hardwired to transport ketones across the blood-brain barrier, although ketone production lags in the beginning, and then lower levels of ketones can contribute to maybe brain fog, lack of energy, but I mean, there's electrolytes at play and a lot of hormonal things going on there too. But nonetheless, an elevation of ketones is really part of that fat adaptation process. It's a really good indication. The ketone level is a really good indication that you're burning fat, because ketones are derived completely from, you know,
fat in the first place.
An overproduction of acetyl-CoA, which comes from beta oxidation. So There's the elevation of fat metabolism is so high, it accumulates acetyl-CoA that condenses to acetylacetate and then beta-hydroxybutyrate. Then that spills into circulation, and the evolutionary role of that is to preserve and maintain energetic flow to the brain and probably the heart too.
Interesting.
So, yeah.
So then if you take it one step further, terms that are thrown around, there's ketosis, there's fat adaptation, and then there's keto adaptation. And there's a difference between keto adaptation and fat adaptation, right? Because like fat adaptation, as you mentioned, that can come into play. You can take an endurance athlete that doesn't necessarily follow a ketogenic protocol, and they'll probably have a lot of type 1 muscle fibers, good amount of mitochondrial density. They'll be largely fat adapted, not necessarily ketogenic, and more than likely not keto adapted, unless they're training in that state maybe.
Yeah, I think, it's hard to put numbers on it to objectively define it, but I think what we can say is that if an athlete is following a lower carb approach, there's something called post-exercise ketosis. So they will deplete glycogen to the point where they enter ketosis and then go out when they do their refeeds or whatever. So they're sort of entering in and out of ketosis if there's any bit of carbohydrate restriction. And for athletes, that could be, for an athlete, I've communicated with athletes that have like an output of 6 hours of exercise per day, and they're consuming 300 or 400 grams of carbs, and they're still entering ketosis.
Wow.
And these are just people just hammering all day, like training for ultra marathons and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So it is a spectrum, and the idea, I think the important concept is that the more we train our metabolism to metabolize fat and away from glucose dependence, I guess you could say, or carbohydrate dependence, the more we do that, we're augmenting metabolic flexibility, right? So if you are completely on a ketogenic diet all the time, 24/7, and then you reintroduce carbs back in, so this is another topic, you could be carbohydrate intolerant, or you could have, your carbohydrate threshold will be significantly reduced if you have restricted carbohydrates for a long period of time. So
correctable very quickly though. Like that rodent model, I mean, it was like what? Like it was a very short amount of time before it was corrected upon re-entering ketosis. So it's like glucose intolerance was a very short-lived amount of time. They corrected very quickly and then bounced back to ketosis very quickly too.
Yeah, and it's also, we have to view this in the context of the amount, right? And a lot of people will follow ketogenic diets. They don't track calories, they don't track. So if they're on a ketogenic diet and they have a refeed, carbohydrate refeed to backload or whatever, they're not, you have to cap it at like 100, 200, 300 grams of carbs and not just go off the rails.
That's the problem.
And that's so easy to do, and you're going to have a major rebound effect where you're going to spike insulin, and that'll lead to significant water and sodium retention. You're going to blow up, you're going to feel bad. Your GI system's not going to handle it. Many of you people watching this, that when you restrict carbohydrates and glucose for a long time and then you reintroduce it, the transporters just are not there in the gut. So a lot of that will just stay in the gut. It'll lead to just like gut dysbiosis and problems there too. So there's the reintroduction of carbohydrates can be really detrimental if it's not calculated. And you have to do it sort of you got to titrate it in and be cognizant of that.
Very good point. I mean, it's very easy to, if you view a nutritional ketogenic protocol as a diet versus a lifestyle, then you are running the risk of, when you do have carbohydrates, treating it as a quote unquote cheat meal. And in every sense of the word, that cheat meal is definitely not going to be good food. So I'm very careful with how I usually instruct that, right? It's like, if you're going to have carbs, it's, tread lightly for sure.
And it depends on your context, like where are you coming from? Are you someone trying to lose weight? Are you someone who's already lean, trying to add and preserve muscle? Are you trying to manage a chronic disorder like, type 2 diabetes or epilepsy or neurological disorder? Your approach is going to be different depending upon, and for some people they may not want to reintroduce carbs to get back in, but I imagine there's a lot of athletes or people who just want to incorporate low carb as a lifestyle to feel better, to look better, and I think catering to that crowd, I think it's okay to talk about cycling carbs, but if you truly wanted to follow a low carb lifestyle and be ketogenic, like you really have to cap your carbs. If you're going to do a carb day to like 100, maybe 150, carbs can go, a little bit goes a long way. And if you're getting carbs and doing more of a targeted ketogenic approach, should probably be called targeted carbohydrate approach. If you're adding carbs in, for me, when occasionally I will do that, 25 to 50 grams of carbs goes a long way.
Yeah.
Right? And a little bit of carbs is also very anti-catabolic. You know, ketones are anti-catabolic too, but the little pulse of insulin you get just by adding 25 grams of carbs or 30 or 40 grams of carbs can go a long way if your goal is to add muscle over time. So that's an important.
Well, and just preservation of tissue as well. And then just like when you look at being able to do some what's called carb backloading, which is where you're having carbs after the workout, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of different factors at play. So coming out of ketosis or having 25, 50, depending on the muscle mass of an individual, maybe 100, whatever, carbohydrates, also being cognizant of what's going to stimulate more of that GLUT4 translocation and really suck it up, right? I mean, that's like for someone like me that has a little bit of muscle on me, like I pay a lot of attention to that. If I'm gonna have carbohydrates, I'm going to move. I'm going to make sure that I'm sucking it up, even if that's doing some air squats or doing some push-ups or going for a walk.
But you're okay without it. So today you
100%.
Arrived at my house, you were fasted. We did, for me, what was a high volume workout. And then after the workout, we had a 1,000-pound bale of hay that we pushed for several hundred yards. So this is highly glycolytic, highly energy dependent. And then we went and ate 0 carbs, and we're here now, hours after. We were fasted, we trained, depleted whatever glycogen we had, ate 0 carbs, and you're basically super sleep deprived. I don't think you slept at all last night, and you're I know that you woke up at like 2 o'clock your time, 2 a.m. your time, and you've had no carbs. You had a tremendously glycogen depleting workout, and you're like sharp as a tack. So, and that I think the listeners need to understand that not everybody can do that. So you've trained your metabolism to be like that, and if you want to be like that, you have to follow this approach, and the more you follow it, the easier it gets and the more benefits you derive from it. So you are reaping really all the benefits right now because you are so fat adapted, probably from your background, and we talked about that a while. So I think it's important that people realize that they could get to that approach, but it's they got to stick with it.
Take some time. And it's definitely, and I mean, clearing the air of, I occasionally have carbohydrates post-workout, usually a very defined strategy. I was talking to you about that last night.
You had like 2 or 3 asparagus sprouts. Maybe that was the only carb.
You clarified when you're like, how many, if you have carbs, like what are your carb days like? And like how many grams of carbs? And I was like, 100. You're like, well, that's not really like a carb day. That's, so, and that's just to clarify, even when I'm cycling with some carbohydrates, I'm still very low carb. And that's a very good point to bring up. And that's also very, individualized for me, but also very exercise dependent, what my training load's like. And I'm going to make a very clear point and go on record when I say this. When I do cycle carbs, I feel if I had to put a number on it, I'm losing about 20% cognitive. Like I feel like I take a big step down. So I do it because sometimes my training intensity is very high volume, 2-3 hours, lots of running. And I feel like in an effort to not go crazy catabolic, it does help to have some carbohydrates. But it comes at a huge risk. I significantly lose cognitive function, and every time before I film, even if I am in a carb phase for a couple of weeks, I take minimum like 2 days fasting prior to filming to make sure I'm back in ketosis deep. Otherwise, I just don't film as well. My brain isn't clicking the same. So it's, you take the good with the bad, indeed.
So I do the same thing. Like if I have carbs, it'll be on the weekend. We tend to go out more, on the weekend. And during the week I have to stay sharp for various reasons, so I don't do that. That's when I pretty much stay low carb. And so I actually was thinking that you intermittent fast every day, all the time.
No.
But so I tried that. I lose muscle, I lose strength, I just lose weight. So, but I incorporate it once, maybe twice a week, and that works really well for me. And then, so it was interesting to find out you
similar process, and we'll do it. I think we should do a separate topic on that altogether. But it's, for me especially, kind of to wrap up, if I do have carbs implemented in,
Yeah.
as a compensatory mechanism for me, I tend to fast a little bit more frequently to offset that, right? So it's, and you know, it's not like a binge-like mentality. I'm not doing it because I feel bad that I ate the carbs.
Yeah.
I just severely end up missing the feeling of the mental clarity that I get. And, you know, as far as because I'm fat adapted, I can get back there pretty quick.
Yep.
And yeah, so I mean, I think it's just important to understand that there's these ranges, like you said, as a spectrum. It's like you start ketosis, you get fat adapted, keto adapted is an even different level. But you know, and I guess we'll wrap this up in a minute. But there's an analogy when you're talking about metabolic switching that I always use, and I feel like it's a pretty decent analogy. It's like if you have a train that's going down a track, and that track forks. You know, and you know, you reach a Y in the track, and there's, you know, that lever that the engineer can jump out, pull the lever. Let's say you're predominantly going to the left. Let's say that's the glucose pathway. So the train's generally going to the left, almost always. So that lever that would make the train go to the right is a little bit rusty. So you come out, and maybe the first couple of times you're trying to switch the tracks from the glucose track to the fat track, you got to really break the rust off.
Yeah, and you got to kick it and do whatever.
The same thing happens if you're going down the fat track all the time. Then you got to move that rust to get back on the glucose track. But if you're consistently moving back and forth, you're breaking that rust up a little bit, and you can kind of, I shouldn't say consistently going back and forth, but if you allow yourself to be adapted to both, you can have a level of glucose tolerance, which whole different story for a different day. But I mean, even the train low studies and sleep low studies and things like that, I occasionally will train. I almost always train fasted, but will occasionally train under small carbohydrate load just to almost force feed my cells more glucose to make sure that they maintain tolerance.
Yep, that's a really good point, and I think we should pick up on that in another discussion. But yeah, that train track switch, that's the metabolic switching that we're talking about. And I do think it's super important to track and understand your metabolism with like a device, like the BioSense device, because it's telling you exactly when you're in ketosis. And if you're doing this and you don't really know if you're in ketosis or you're not tracking in different ways, it's hard to even subjectively, there's a way that you feel when you're in ketosis or not in ketosis that I can feel and that we can feel, but most people doing this don't have that. And in the beginning, I think it's really important to track, and then you track and then you know how you feel and you can almost predict what your ketone levels are. And I think it's really important to track in the beginning, so it's an important point.
Well, Mr. Dom, thanks for coming on, and we're going to knock out a few other videos, so make sure you're keeping it locked in and as these videos trickle out over time. But as always, keep it locked in on the channel.